Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Weemhoff with the Michigan Center for Youth Justice, and I'm here to present a session for the forum today that focuses on the dangers of for-profit facilities. Specifically, this work is centered around a case in Michigan that's recently risen to national attention, but I will be focusing a lot on strategies that you can use in your state and nationally, not only to end the use of for-profits, but to increase oversight for private facilities and ensure the safety and well-being of all kids that are in juvenile facilities. The Michigan Center for Youth Justice is the Michigan member for NJJN. We actually were a founding member of NJJN under the name Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. And in 2019, we changed our name and revitalized our mission to be really clear that we are focused on reducing confinement and supporting community-based solutions for Michigan's justice-involved youth, children, youth, and young adults. Before I jump into this presentation, I wanted to offer a warning. The content on the next slide and referenced throughout this presentation includes graphic detail related to the death of a Black teen that may trigger trauma and emotional distress. Our intent is to honor the life of Cornelius Fredericks by ensuring that such horrific acts of violence are not perpetrated against any other young people. However, you are encouraged to be mindful of your own reactions to this content and discontinue viewing the presentation or skip ahead if this presents too much emotional or psychological distress for you. So we're going to start with a heartbreaking story. On May 1st, 2020, Cornelius Fredericks died after being restrained for throwing a sandwich at Lakeside Academy in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is run by for-profit company Sequel Youth and Family Services. Video from the facility shows at least one staff place their weight directly on Cornelius' chest for over 9 minutes as he lost consciousness. Despite the presence of supervisors and nursing staff, and despite the fact that Cornelius was unresponsive, employees waited 12 minutes before calling 911. Such egregious use of force and tragic loss of life is absolutely appalling. Cornelius's life mattered. It is absolutely essential that we mobilize around this and ensure that this never happens again. For-profit companies are intended to make money. They're driven by the bottom line. And unfortunately, that does not always align with what is in the best interest of children. The model that these for-profit companies often use is to fill the beds because they get paid per child per day and then keep the costs down in other ways in order to maximize their profits. But we know that confining youth is generally ineffective. It is counterproductive to create a profit incentive that would increase the number of youth in these facilities and lengthen their stay. NJJN has created an excellent policy platform if you want to dig into some more research on this topic, that their platform outlines a lot of the harms in these facilities. And I should emphasize that we're not just talking about juvenile justice facilities. In fact, Cornelius was a foster youth. His mother had passed away when he was 10 and his father did not have custody. And so they were in a facility that had both child welfare and juvenile justice youth. So these concerns around for-profits expand to behavioral health, child welfare, and juvenile justice. Sequel Youth and Family Services is the for-profit company that was brought in by Lakeside to provide management over their behavioral health services. They also provide at least 27 residential facilities, many of which have kids that are in foster care. But this is not the first time that we have seen Sequel in the news for harming children. In 2019, we saw Clarinda facility in Iowa have allegations of negligence, physical and sexual abuse. Also in 2019, Red Rock Canyon was closed in St. George, Utah after a riot broke out there. And now in 2020, we've just learned that Cortland and Owens Crossroads facilities in Alabama are coming under scrutiny for improper restraints, inadequate supervision, and degrading treatment of their residents. Specifically, Lakeside embodied a lot of the problems that we see with for-profit organizations. When we looked at the list of substantiated allegations over the past couple of years, we found allegations of assault, pushing, slapping, choking, scratching, cursing, bullying, as well as multiple instances of inappropriate restraint. They had numerous violations that noted lack of supervision, inadequate training, and understaffing, which are all common violations in for-profit companies. NJJN identified at least 10 violations when investigating Cornelius's death, including evidence of a similar restraint that had been performed on him back in January that was never reported. After this happened, MCYJ sprang into action and created a list of demands. First, Sequel must leave Michigan, and no for-profit facility should be allowed to manage confined youth in our state. Not only was Sequel operating at Lakeside, but they are also currently operating at Star Commonwealth, which is a facility in Albion, Michigan. Next, the community should lead decision-making regarding closing and repurposing Lakeside. This is not the first time that Lakeside has had a violation. In fact, in 2006, they lost their license after a sexual assault on staff on a youth and a riot at the facility, and they brought in Sequel to better manage their services. At that time, there was a lot of coverage in the media about Lakeside executives talking about rebuilding trust with the community, and that has completely been lost. It is critical now that the community be involved in deciding what happens with that facility. 3, youth who ran away from the facility in the aftermath should not be punished. Immediately after the incident with Cornelius, over 30 young people fled the campus in fear of their lives. It was also discovered shortly after that between 30 and 40 youth had, as well as 9 staff, had COVID and that had not been appropriately reported to the authorities. We want to make sure that there were young people from Michigan as well as around the country. There were, I believe, 75 young people from other states and 47 from Michigan. So we want to make sure that all these young people, instead of being punished for running away, are actually provided trauma counseling services because it was a highly traumatic incident, and then having to be rehoused in the middle of a pandemic. We want to make sure that these kids are given proper care and not punishment. 4, all investigations into the incident should be public record. And to date, I'll talk about the investigations momentarily. We believe that that has happened. And lastly, we want to create a state-level position such as a juvenile justice ombudsman to make sure that there's greater oversight of private facilities and to ensure accountability. So this work has really required a local, state, and national level strategy. So I'm going to start with talking about our national strategies first. Of course, immediately after this happened, we called NJJN and they sprang into action. NJJN drafted a petition calling for an end to the use of for-profit youth facilities. That petition, I have a clip of the picture here. We were at 7,500 at that point. Now that petition is close to 60,000. So thank you for everyone who helped mobilize around that and get the word out. NJJN, MCYJ, as well as Youth First hosted a National Day of Action, which I'll talk about shortly. They also hosted a multi-state strategy call to learn more about Sequel concerns in other states. And one of the main strategies is going to be focusing on accreditation. Currently, Sequel is accredited by the Joint Commission, one of the nation's largest accrediting bodies. Historically, they've been focused on providing accreditation to healthcare and hospitals, but they have since expanded to behavioral health care, which is where Sequel falls. I thought this quote was interesting on their website. The bottom line, Joint Commission accreditation helps us attract customers who might not look at us otherwise. The gold seal gives us instant credibility. The language in this it reinforces the idea that this is a for-profit company looking for customers. In 2019, the Joint Commission granted Sequel national accreditation after completing a pilot behavioral healthcare system survey process. Basically, they have accreditation system-wide for all of their facilities without having to go through an accrediting process for each one for each state. We have huge concerns about this because we know that every facility is different, but there has been a pattern and a practice over many Sequel facilities where we've seen inappropriate use of restraints, physical altercations, many misconducts, and we feel there needs to be a much more intensive process for oversight here. So NJJN will be coordinating a process that's looking at how we can pressure the Joint Commission to re-review accreditation. for sequel. At the state level, MCYJ immediately contacted the governor's office and the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services to make sure that they knew about the incident and give them more background about sequel and about some of the other concerns that we had. We've continued to be in constant communication with them. We also compiled a list of substantiated violations from Lakeside that were available on the NJJN public website, and we researched policies around restraint and oversight to see where the gaps were that we could maybe improve. Next, we submitted FOIA requests to retain copies of the facility contracts and a list of Michigan youth who are placed out of state. In that request, we also asked for a list of where all the youth from Lakeside have been rehoused since that campus closed. As I mentioned, 47 of them were from Michigan and another 75 were from other states. So that will help us to get a better sense of where those kids were coming from. And lastly, we launched a media campaign under the hashtag Justice for Cornelius. And I will just minimize my little face here so that I can show you. This is a sample of one of the graphics that we created so that we could help drive attention to this issue. In terms of our media strategy, we really focused on both traditional media as well as social media. For all of the traditional media, we reached out to a number of reporters. We started drafting op-eds. We created a website called miyouthjustice.org/justice for Cornelius, where you can see all of the media coverage that this case has received. I also included a link to a great op-ed which was written by NJJN's Executive Director, Ricky Watson. You can either go to this link or Google the title, Keep For-Profit Operators Out of Juvenile Justice. It's a really excellent piece, and I feel like these types of strategies help to elevate the story until some of the investigations were complete. At the local level, we use both grassroots and grasstops organizing. And I probably should have said earlier in the presentation that this is the community where I live. My house is just on the outskirts of the city of Kalamazoo. I drive by Lakeside every day, and it's just heartbreaking to know that something like this has happened in our own backyard. So we're working with a local grassroots leader here called PACT, Promise Advocacy for Children and Community Transformation. And they partnered with another group called Save Our Youth to form a protest to elevate this story and make sure that people in the community knew that this had happened. We also reached out to the mayor's office, the police, the local coalition around racial justice, the local network for youth service providers, really making sure that all of the key players and important stakeholders in our local community were aware of the issue. PACT is also facilitating community listening sessions, which I'll talk about shortly, and connecting with current and former staff, and they also joined in the National Day of Action. I just wanted to share with you a copy of the flyer as well as one of the pictures from the protest. They actually gathered at Lakeside and heard from a number of speakers there, and then decorated their cars and drove through the city to the detention center where they heard another speaker. And not only were they elevating the story around Cornelius, but they also sort of tied this in with some of the other work that's happening locally around getting police out of schools and other issues around racial justice to really emphasize that this is not a one-time incident. There really are systemic issues that this is starting to highlight. PACT is also organizing 5 community listening sessions. We thought this was really important to make sure that the community could have a voice in what happens with this facility. And they were able to find some current employees who talked about Cornelius. It was the first listening session was very emotional and resulted in a lot of great ideas, though, about how we could better use this space. Specifically, some of the ideas from the first listening session were that Lakeside needs to change its name, create a new vision, get people of color and more community members on the board, and create a youth advisory board. And then we talked about ideas for repurposing. Perhaps things like a Cornelius Fredericks community center, a summer camp, a community pool or ropes course, a hub for nonprofits, an incubator for small businesses owned by people who are formerly incarcerated, affordable housing, a lot of ideas. There's still a couple of listening sessions coming up, 1 or 2 of which will be specifically focused on youth. So I think we're going to have a lot of really impactful ideas, and hopefully we'll be able to get buy-in from the folks who are at the top of Lakeside. Together, NJJN, Youth First, and MCYJ launched a national day of action to draw attention to Cornelius's case and specifically to talk about the harms associated with for-profit facilities. We worked with a number of amazing partners, including Color of Change and a number of Michigan-based advocacy organizations, to spread this information far and wide. They used a social media toolkit. You're seeing some of the sample graphics that we had below. We also included sample tweets, and we worked with the Troubled podcast, which helped leverage different platforms of social media, such as Instagram and TikTok, to really get this message to go viral, and that's exactly what happened. Since that time, the petition has increased sixfold and is continuing to grow. We are at the point of nearly 60,000 signatures so far, and every signature is an email to either Governor Whitmer in Michigan or governors in other states where CEQA facilities are located. Okay, so you've heard a lot of our organizing strategy. Now we're going to move more into the policy discussion. First, we had to figure out who all was investigating this case. There are so many entities that we needed to map out. So if you ever find yourself in an unfortunate position where you're pushing for an investigation of something, here are some of the entities that you might want to consider. First, there's always going to be an internal investigation at the facility itself. This is basically a report written by the people who were involved and their supervisors. Push to make sure that any subsequent independent investigations do not only reference that document. That's one story. We also want to hear from other people who might have witnessed the incident, and absolutely need to interview youth. Any investigation report that you see, always ask how many youth were interviewed to inform this information. Next, there's a law enforcement investigation. This is done by the police, and then they would provide the information over to the prosecutor's office to determine if any charges need to be filed. You can FOIA information from the police, or you could also wait until the prosecutor makes their charges, and then you could FOIA the police report as part of prosecutor information as well. The Michigan Department of Public Health and Human Services, they're the ones who oversee all of our child caring institutions and our juvenile justice system, and they had multiple levels of investigations as well. So there's within DHHS, there's licensing, there's contract compliance, and then we also have something called continuous quality improvement, which is per our child welfare consent decree. So you might also have something like that where they can do an investigation. Their investigation on quality improvement is really how can we do things better. For licensing and contract, that actually can result in either suspension or a revocation of their license, or ending the contract so no kids can be placed there. And then Michigan Protection and Advocacy, that's your local disability rights network, a member of the National Disability Rights Network. And they have federal authority to go into any facility that serves a person with disabilities. So all of our child caring institutions are able to go in there. They also can go into prisons, jails, hospitals, and they are launching an independent investigation as well. And then we talked about accreditation a little bit earlier, but the accrediting body can also look into an They typically won't do a full investigation, but you can file a safety event so that they're aware that something like this has happened, and then that might be something that they reference if they need to do a re-review of the accreditation, or if there's any ongoing reapplication for ongoing accreditation. At the end of our National Day of Action, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services issued a statement about the conclusions in their investigation and announced that they would be suspending Lakeside's license to operate as a child caring institution in Michigan because they found so many violations that led to Cornelius's death. They also announced that they are creating a policy to prohibit the use of all restraints in child caring institutions in Michigan, and that they would help provide technical assistance to ensure that swift implementation. So that was a huge win for us. As part of this announcement, MDHHS also said that they would be contracting with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Casey Family Programs, and Building Bridges Initiatives to come in and do an independent assessment of the department's licensing and contract oversight functions. We feel like this is going to be very helpful in highlighting some of the inadequacies that we have observed in terms of incomplete data systems, as well as ineffective oversight strategies. So we're hopeful that those recommendations, which are not yet released, will be useful as we push for more robust policy reform. A few days after the Department of Health and Human Services issues their prohibition on restraints, the governor also released a statement on Lakeside and specifically said that protecting vulnerable children is one of their top priorities. And as a result, she has instructed the department to take every step necessary to ensure that Sequel Youth and Family Services no longer provides services for facilities licensed by the department. This is a huge win for us. The petition that NJJN had set up ensured that every signature on the petition sent a direct email to Governor Whitmer. At this point, when she issued this statement, she had received 7,500 emails. We now know that that number is somewhere up around 60,000, so we are keeping the pressure on to make sure that Sequel gets out. All right, and then also just to give you a bit of an update on the civil and criminal proceedings. On the 22nd of June, Cornelius' family hired Marco Law, and they filed a civil lawsuit looking for damages around $100 million against Lakeside Academy and Sequel. Specifically, they noted that the conduct of Lakeside Academy staff was not only improper but clearly excessive in nature, and they alleged negligence by failing to provide a safe environment and properly supervise their employees. And then finally, this past week, the Kalamazoo prosecutor filed criminal charges against 3 individuals involved in the incident. 2 youth services specialists were charged with involuntary manslaughter for knowingly causing harm by laying on his abdomen, as well as second-degree child abuse and second-degree child abuse for a child care organization violation causing death. And then additionally, a nurse was charged with involuntary manslaughter for gross negligence and failure to perform her legal duty to obtain medical care. While this might feel like a win, we did hear directly from staff at the listening session who said that these people deeply cared about the kids, that they were the ones to make sure that Cornelius had a good birthday, that they would stay late to hang out with the kids, and that part of the problem that led to this incident was that restraint was part of the culture and part of the training. So this is not to give a pass to anybody who was involved in this incident, but I think it's important to recognize that this is not just the fault of 3 individuals, but in fact a system-wide toxic culture that encouraged and allowed something like this to happen. All right, next step. So we know that the Department of Health and Human Services and the governor's office have made some really important, laid some really important groundwork for changes that are going to happen, but we know that it needs to be codified in legislation to remain permanent. So our legislative asks are to push for for-profit facilities to not be permitted to provide any type of congregate care for children in Michigan, that youth facilities, most of which are private in Michigan, should receive oversight from an independent state-level ombudsman or even a broader oversight committee that would include advocates, youth, and families to ensure accountability, and that legislation must be created to codify policy changes that DHHS is making around the prohibition of restraints. It must be against the law to restrain children. All right, so hopefully some of the things that we've used in Michigan would be useful strategies for your state as well. But if you are thinking about closing a facility or trying to end the use of for-profits in your state, here are some additional things to consider. 1, elevate the voices and the stories of youth and families. Their story is going to be the most powerful tool you have to show that this is not the best way to serve kids. 2, facility violations should be public information and available online. So I would highly recommend that you go into your website for your equivalent of DHHS and try to find that information and keep a running tab of it so that you can notice if there are patterns or concerns that need to be brought to your attention, to the attention of the officials. Also, partner with your local protection and advocacy group. That would be the member of the National Disability Rights Network in your state. They do have federal authority to go in and do visits and investigations of facilities that house people with disabilities. But also, if you share your concerns about a facility violation, they can look into that for you. So it's a really excellent partner. We're really grateful to have those partners in Michigan. And finally, private nonprofit facilities might be a really good ally for you in pushing for-profits out. They're basically competitors. So if you have a mix of private as well as for-profit, see if the private organizations would be willing to be part of your coalition. And I wouldn't be a good advocate if I didn't end this presentation by asking you to take action. So first, sign that change.org petition, Justice for Cornelius, shut down sequel. Next, track how many youth are placed out of state from your state and work to return them to in-state options, preferably in the community. Urge your state to end the use of restraints. Hopefully we'll have model legislation available in Michigan soon, but if not, we have a lot of resources that we could share with you, so please feel free to reach out because we would love to see this as a movement across the country. And finally, urge your state department over youth services to end all contracts with for-profit facilities and to increase the oversight of private facilities. We cannot emphasize enough that children are not commodities and that we must have options for them that are really prioritizing their safety and well-being. And with that said, I'd like to end this presentation with a moment of silence to honor the life and legacy of Cornelius Fredericks.